The figure known historically as King Henry VIII of England was born on the 28th of June 1491 at Greenwich Palace, situated just outside of London. His father was King Henry VII, the foundational monarch of the House of Tudor, who held the titles of King of England and Lord of Ireland. He governed from 1485, when he seized the throne of England at the culmination of the Wars of the Roses, until his death in 1509, at which point he was succeeded by his second son, also named Henry. Henry VIII's mother was Elizabeth of York, the daughter of King Edward IV, who had reigned over England for the majority of the period between 1461 and 1483. As a princess from the House of York, her marriage to Henry VII facilitated a process of reconciliation and healing between the two prominent houses of York and Lancaster, following years of civil conflict. She bore her husband 7 children. Prior to Henry's birth, a son and a daughter named Arthur and Margaret had arrived in 1486 and 1489, respectively. 3 daughters and another son would follow Henry, although of these, only Mary, born in 1496, would survive to live a long life. Elizabeth, Edmund, and Catherine all died either in infancy or during their early childhood years. As the second son born to his parents, Henry was never anticipated to assume the kingship. Instead, that responsibility was expected to fall upon his elder brother, Arthur, the Prince of Wales. Consequently, Henry grew up embodying the role of the royal spare rather than the heir. He received instruction from several tutors at the palace at Eltham, where he was raised. These educators instructed him in grammar, rhetoric, history, philosophy, logic, and arithmetic, as well as various languages, including French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, and Greek. Henry exhibited equal aptitude for both athletic pursuits and musical endeavors. It is said that he composed his own music at different junctures throughout his life, and although it is challenging to recall when considering the obese individual afflicted by a debilitating leg ulcer he became in his later years, as a young man he possessed a naturally athletic physique. The poet John Skelton undertook Henry's education concerning his moral obligations, while Henry also developed a relatively strong adherence to Roman Catholic piety. His mother, Elizabeth, instructed him in writing from a young age, a fact evidenced by the resemblances in their handwriting styles. By the time he had acquired the skill of writing, he already held several significant titles, including those of Duke of York, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Earl Marshal of England, and Warden of the Scottish Marches. He may not have been the designated heir, but Henry VII certainly bestowed considerable honors upon his younger son through numerous titles. Henry was the object of exceptional admiration during his boyhood, as some of the most renowned intellectuals in both England and across Europe, including Sir Thomas More, the celebrated author of Utopia, and the Dutch philosopher Desiderius Erasmus, considered the most acclaimed scholar in Northern Europe at the beginning of the 16th century, publicly expressed their astonishment at his intelligence and charisma. More wrote about Henry in his poetry, hailing him as a savior and a new messiah, though such royal flattery was a conventional practice of the early modern period. Both More and Erasmus met Henry as a young man in 1490 while at Eltham Palace. Aside from these encounters, Henry experienced a largely happy childhood surrounded by his mother, sisters, and paternal grandmother, all of whom openly doted upon him. Indeed, some historians have put forward the idea that it was Henry's childhood, spent as a central figure in a circle of adoring women, that contributed to his development as an individual inclined towards passionate romantic attachments, yet also possessing a marked petulance when his desires were not immediately met. On the 2nd of April, 1502, Henry's older brother Arthur passed away, potentially from tuberculosis or the mysterious sweating sickness, a disease historians have speculated was either a form of influenza or a hantavirus. The death of the heir represented in many ways the pivotal event of Henry's life. It became absolutely essential that a seamless transition of power occurred upon Henry VII's eventual death. He had claimed the throne after vanquishing the Yorkist pretender, King Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Not long before this, Richard had seized the throne by incarcerating his nephews and, most likely, arranging their murder within the Tower of London. This brutal act on Richard's part had ensured that many people in England were willing to support Henry Tudor's cause in 1485. Yet there is also no question that the House of Tudor possessed a very tenuous claim to the throne of England. being descended through a line of the distinguished 14th century King of England, Edward III, which lineage was widely regarded as illegitimate because it originated from Edward's fourth son, John of Gaunt's marriage to Catherine Swynford and the children born out of wedlock from that union. Henry VII now personally oversaw the education of his 10-year-old son, who was promptly invested with the title Prince of Wales. This marked the beginning of a struggle between father and son, as while Arthur had been alive, Henry had been somewhat neglected by the king. However, with Arthur's death and Henry now the Prince of Wales, the stern and imposing Henry VII became deeply involved in his son's daily routine. This quickly led to numerous clashes of will between the two, the primary point of contention being a disagreement over Henry's passion for jousting and other martial activities, pursuits that Henry VII understandably prohibited him from engaging in now that they could imperil the life of the future king. Young Henry felt embarrassed by being restricted to participating only in unarmed training exercises while his peers were able to both display their skills and defend their masculine honor in the jousting lists. In addition to this, over the following years, father and son grew more distant as Henry VII became an increasingly unpopular ruler due to his financial policies and his reliance on a small circle of secretive advisors who alienated much of the political class from the king, while Prince Henry was seen as the young prospective king who offered the promise of a more favorable future. Although Henry VII's prudent governance might have earned him the resentment of his subjects, he would ultimately place the English state on a solid financial footing and bequeath a considerable surplus to his son one day. Another significant aspect of the years following Arthur's death concerned his widow and the question of Henry's potential marriage. In 1501, prior to his premature passing, Arthur had married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella thus of Castile, whose own union had unified the two major kingdoms of Spain. The marriage of Arthur and Catherine had been intended to foster an alliance between England and Spain. Arthur's death seemed to jeopardize this prospect, although almost immediately thereafter, Henry VII had initiated correspondence with Catherine's parents in Spain regarding the possibility of Catherine now marrying Prince Henry. The negotiations dragged on interminably throughout the 1500s, during which entire period Catherine remained in England. The issues surrounding the matter revolved around Catherine's dowry, or marriage portion, that was to be paid to the English crown by her parents, and also whether or not Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage. If they had, Henry could not marry Catherine, according to canon law. The discussions regarding the proposed marriage were still ongoing 7 years later when Henry VII died on the 21st of April, 1509. Upon his father's death, the Prince of Wales was instantly proclaimed King Henry VIII of England. An atmosphere of optimism and joy permeated the ranks of the nobility, courtiers, gentry, and commoners alike throughout England. Many foresaw the dawn of a golden age for England as the tall, athletic, and handsome Henry, with his notable intelligence, charisma, and wit, ascended the throne at the age of 17. He would soon be married. Only 3 weeks after his father's death, on the 11th of June, 1509, Henry married Catherine in a brief private ceremony held at the Church of the Observant Friars just outside of Greenwich Palace. She was 6 years Henry's senior, and there remained unresolved questions regarding the validity of the marriage according to canon law, although a papal dispensation had been granted to permit it to proceed. Despite how controversial it would become in later years, Henry and Catherine's marriage was initially a happy one. He genuinely respected her, likely more so than any of his subsequent wives. For her part, Catherine proved a devoted wife, even long after Henry had ceased desiring her to be. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, anointed the royal couple with sacred oil and crowned them both to enthusiastic cries of "Vivat! Vivat Rex!" or "Long live the King!" This marked the last occasion that a joint coronation of a king and queen would occur in England for nearly 2 centuries, as most of the 6 monarchs who followed were unmarried at the time of their own coronations. Following the initial ceremony, 2 days of celebratory feasting and armed tournaments ensued, including the jousting contests of which Henry's father had so strongly disapproved. Henry's well-known reputation as a tyrant might lead some to assume that Catherine's initial inability to produce a male heir for England was a source of conflict between the Queen and her husband. In reality, Henry and Catherine's marriage continued in what appeared to be a warm and mutually supportive state for several years. Henry seems to have exhibited patience and understanding regarding Catherine's struggle to provide him with an heir. There are sound reasons for this perspective. In 16th century England, child mortality was considerably more prevalent than it is today, and a wife, particularly one of noble or royal status, might have a dozen or more children to compensate for the unfortunate reality that many would not survive infancy or their childhood years. Depending on various factors, between one-third and half of all pregnancies would result in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant mortality. While these occurrences were undoubtedly viewed as tragic, Catherine's demonstrated capacity to conceive easily was actually seen as an encouraging indicator that she would eventually give birth to a healthy son and heir. In the interim, the young royal couple displayed impressive cooperation in the governance and management of England's affairs. Henry pardoned many of his father's debtors and made conscious efforts to resolve the animosity that had existed with those who had been in conflict with his father. His charm and generosity earned him the favor of both the nobility and the general populace. In addition to this, Catherine was greatly admired for her intellect, resilience, piety, and devotion to the English people. When Henry launched a joint invasion of France, alongside the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, in the summer of 1513, he appointed Catherine to serve as regent during his absence, a clear demonstration of the confidence he placed in her abilities. The war had originated as both an extension of the Italian wars being fought between France and Spain for dominance over the Italian peninsula, and also from Henry's desire to reignite the Hundred Years' War, during which England had attempted to conquer much of France in the 14th and 15th centuries. In Italy, Pope Julius II and King Louis XI of France were engaged in conflict over the Italian states controlled by the papacy. Pope Julius excommunicated Louis and formed a coalition of nations. To persuade the young Henry to join them in the league, he sent him barrels of Italian wine, a rose fashioned from gold, and a consignment of Parmesan cheeses. In England, Archbishop Warham had advocated for peace and spoken against the evils of war, though ultimately Henry had decided otherwise. In this decision, he found support from the Lord Chancellor, Thomas Wolsey, a leading figure within the English Church and soon to become a cardinal. Wolsey also served as the principal minister of Henry's government throughout much of the 1510s and 1520s and wielded immense power. On the 28th of June 1513, with the resolution to wage war already taken, the king and queen arrived at Dover Castle in Kent. Henry crossed the English Channel the following day to join the fight against King Louis of France. For the first time in nearly a century since the celebrated era of King Henry IV and the Battle of Agincourt, an English king would now endeavor to expand his territories on the continent, which after the losses suffered in the final decades of the Hundred Years' War, had been reduced to nothing more than a small territory around Calais. Henry's initial victory occurred at Terouanne, followed by a triumph at the Battle of the Spurs, so named because the mounted French knights retreated from the field with such speed, utilizing their spurs to urge their horses onward as quickly as possible. While Henry pursued his aspirations of English military glory in France, Catherine was concurrently engaged in confronting an invasion of England by the Scots, the traditional allies of the French under the command of King James IV. Within 2 months of Henry's invasion of France, King James invaded England in support of his French confederates. Catherine, however, proved capable of meeting the challenge in Henry's absence. Catherine was personally involved in the military mobilization and strategic planning for England's defense. The English forces, heavily comprising longbowmen and led by Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, defeated the Scots at the Battle of Flodden on the 9th of September, 1513. At the battle, the English forces achieved victory over a numerically superior Scottish army. James IV perished on the battlefield, along with as many as 17,000 of his 40,000-strong army, while the English, in contrast, suffered the loss of only 1,500 men from their host of 26,000. The Queen, in her correspondence to Henry after the victory, lauded his successes abroad and sent, as a symbol of her own triumph, a fragment of the Scottish king's coat to be added to the king's banners, as his army proceeded to capture parts of Flanders, as well as Tournai, where Henry ordered the construction of a substantial castle, a symbol of what he perceived as his expanding continental empire. During the period of the 1520s, it became increasingly evident that Catherine would not be able to produce a son and heir. She reached her 40th birthday in December 1525, and thereafter, her prospects of delivering any further children, let alone a healthy boy, diminished progressively. Long before that time, Henry had begun to take mistresses with greater regularity. Such behavior was not necessarily an indication of his diminishing affection for his wife. Most kings in early modern Europe maintained one or multiple mistresses. In June 1519, one of these women, Elizabeth Blount, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, gave birth to Henry's son. The king acknowledged the boy as his biological child, and he was named Henry Fitzroy, Henry after his father. While Fitzroy literally translates to son of the king, Henry bestowed lavish attention and titles upon his son, but under English law, the boy was illegitimate and could not succeed his father. Nevertheless, with the birth of Henry Fitzroy, Henry had demonstrated his capacity to father a son. While the king never openly attributed blame to Catherine for her perceived failure to produce a boy, the years following the birth of his illegitimate son saw a gradual decline in the previously harmonious relationship between Henry and Catherine. Aside from his dynastic challenges, the first 10 years of Henry's reign clearly demonstrated his ambitious quest for glory. Henry aimed to elevate England to a position of equality with both France and Spain in terms of wealth, power, and international standing. Early in his reign, he sponsored the construction of dockyards, warehouses, and shipyards in coastal ports and procured vast quantities of timber from the forests of Sussex and Kent for the building of a large naval fleet. Henry's father had become king during the very nascent stages of Europe's age of exploration. Not to be outdone by the Spanish, he had initiated a program of naval expansion and sponsored the initial significant English voyages of discovery. It is, for example, frequently overlooked that it was a pilot employed by the English, John Cabot, who became the first early modern European to reach the mainland of North America in 1497, while Columbus was still navigating among the islands of the Caribbean. However, the English navy remained relatively small by 1509. Henry the Baptist set about transforming this, and by the 1540s, it had been expanded to approximately 50 ships. Henry was determined to be remembered not only as a prince of intellect and virtue, but also as one accomplished in the art of statesmanship. The growing controversy surrounding the writings of Martin Luther in Germany from 1517 onwards, and the Protestant Reformation that it inspired, soon presented him with an opportunity to showcase his erudition. Luther had emerged as a severe critic of the papacy in Rome and the considerable wealth and power of the church in general, arguing that the corruption within it required eradication and the establishment of a new form of Christianity. This new form, according to Luther, would see churches stripped of their idolatrous wealth, the Mass performed in the vernacular languages rather than Latin, and individuals encouraged to read the Bible themselves and engage directly with Scripture. Henry, however, was a staunch doctrinal Catholic who appreciated the authority, ritual, and tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. In response to the perceived heresy emanating from Central Europe, in 1521 he composed a text titled Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. In this work, Henry attacked Luther's ideas, defended established Catholic practices, and affirmed the supremacy of the Pope over the Church in Europe in all religious matters. Henry even dedicated the text to Pope Leo VI, who, in recognition of his service to the Church, bestowed upon Henry the title Fide Defensor, meaning defender of the faith. Whether Henry personally authored the entirety of the Defense of the Seven Sacraments remains a subject of debate among historians. Thomas More may well have provided assistance and certainly offered commentary on drafts of the work. By the mid-1520s, Henry's marital circumstances were becoming increasingly strained. He was no longer the popular young king of his teenage years, but was still a relatively young man in his 30s. His thoughts had seemingly not independently gravitated towards the possibility of divorcing Catherine and seeking a remarriage to a woman who might produce a son. Instead, it was the arrival of Anne Boleyn at the Tudor court at this time that steered Henry down this path. Anne was a daughter of Thomas Boleyn, who had served as Henry's ambassador to France. She had recently returned from the French court with her father and was widely admired for her sophisticated demeanor, her stylishness, wit, and charm. Her exact year of birth is uncertain, though it was likely 1501, placing her in her mid-20s when Henry became captivated by her. For the initial few months of their courtship, there appeared to be no question of Henry setting aside his wife. However, Anne possessed an understanding of how to influence the king. She refused to become his mistress as long as he remained married, insisting that she would only commit in such a way to her future husband. Over time, Henry became increasingly obsessed, and his letters to Anne, some of which are still extant, are filled with passionate declarations of his love and desire for her. He and his advisors quickly identified a potentially valid justification for seeking an annulment of his marriage, which had by then lasted nearly 2 decades. When Henry had initially wed Catherine, he had done so despite objections that she had previously been married to his deceased brother Arthur, and that their brief union had possibly been sexually completed. This circumstance would have violated canon law as expressed in Leviticus 20:21, which reads, quote, "If any man should take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They will be childless." To circumvent this impediment, it had been asserted back in the 1500s that Catherine and Arthur had, in fact, never shared physical intimacy as husband and wife, thus enabling Henry to marry Catherine. Now, 18 years after their initial marriage, Henry conveniently began to experience a crisis of conscience regarding the matter. It was soon being argued in England that the marriage in 1509 had, contrary to earlier assertions, constituted a transgression of fundamental religious law. Based on these premises, Henry commenced petitioning Pope Clement VII in Rome for an annulment of his first marriage, which would then allow him to wed Anne. The king would devote more than half a decade to pursuing what became known within court circles and in English political discourse as his great matter. In the process, he would fundamentally alter the trajectory of English political and religious history. The endeavor began with a direct appeal addressed to Pope Clement VII. Popes had, on occasion, been known to grant annulments of marriages even on somewhat questionable legal grounds, particularly when the marriage in question had failed to produce a male heir. This practice could help avoid contentious succession disputes and potential wars. However, in this specific instance, there was no possibility of Clement acquiescing to Henry's request. Around the time Henry began petitioning Clement in 1527, the Spanish and imperial forces loyal to Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, had sacked and subsequently occupied the city of Rome. With the Pope effectively a captive of Charles, he was in no position to consent to annul the marriage. Consequently, Henry turned to Cardinal Wolsey, who had consistently served him loyally and who owed his entire elevated status to the king's patronage. Wolsey himself did not originate from the ranks of the nobility. He was the son of a butcher from Ipswich and began his career as an obscure chaplain until, through Henry's favor, he was elevated to the positions of bishop, then archbishop, and ultimately a cardinal and papal legate within England. The task of resolving the king's great matter in the late 1520s thus fell upon Wolsey. Wolsey had served not only as Henry's Lord Chancellor, but also as his mentor. However, his eventual inability to secure the desired divorce would lead to his downfall. The cardinal, collaborating with Cardinal Campeggio, a special representative appointed by the Pope, established a legatine court to adjudicate Henry's great matter. Yet the court was unable to reach a definitive conclusion and instead ruled that the issue should be decided by the College of Cardinals in Rome. It remains uncertain whether Wolsey genuinely intended to satisfy Henry's desire for a divorce, or if he perceived the inherent danger in permitting the king to divorce his widely respected and famously pious Catholic wife and marry Anne, who was rumored to be sympathetic to the small but growing community of Lutheran Protestant reformers that had emerged in urban centers such as London, Oxford, and Cambridge. Regardless of his true intentions, the failure of the legatine court resulted in Wolsey's disgrace. Henry commanded his arrest and imprisonment, citing the treasonous tenor of letters Wolsey had dispatched to Vatican officials. However, the cardinal ultimately died of natural causes while en route to London before Henry could carry out any planned execution. Henry also took possession of Hampton Court, the magnificent palace that Wolsey had personally transformed from a modest country dwelling, subsequently designating it a royal residence. Following the cardinal's demise, Henry did not passively await a change of heart from the Pope. Instead, he began to solicit the opinions of theologians at universities across Europe, requesting that they examine, deliberate upon, and render a judgment regarding the merits of his case for divorce. However, Henry would encounter disappointment on 2 further occasions, as the majority of university theologians and later, the College of Cardinals decided in favor of Queen Catherine, declaring the king's first marriage legally valid. It is not entirely clear when Henry first began to contemplate repudiating the Pope's authority within England. thereby removing the obstacle to his divorce. The influence of Anne Boleyn, known for her sympathies towards Lutheran reform, is certainly a plausible factor, as is the influence of Thomas Cromwell, an individual who had risen through service to Wolsey but who survived the cardinal's downfall and skillfully ingratiated himself into Henry's confidence around 1529. Cromwell would go on to exercise significant influence over the government throughout the 1530s. Alternatively, a key figure in the king's move towards separating from Rome was a relatively obscure clergyman and theology professor from Cambridge named Thomas Cranmer. According to Cranmer, who was at that time a moderate Lutheran but would later become a more radical Calvinist, kings were divinely appointed and answered solely to God. Therefore, Henry should not have been required to pursue his divorce through conventional legal channels. He certainly did not need the Pope's permission to divorce his wife. This perspective emboldened Henry to formally sever ties with the Roman Catholic Church and assert a claim to be the supreme head of the Church of England. By that time, Henry had already remarried 4 months prior, having wed Anne Boleyn in a clandestine ceremony on the 25th of January, 1533. Anne was pregnant at that juncture, although it is likely that neither she nor the king were aware of this on the day of their union, as on the 7th of September, 1533, just 7.5 months after their marriage, Anne gave birth to their first child. Although Henry expressed his pleasure, he cannot but have experienced disappointment that the child was a baby girl. They named her Elizabeth in memory of Henry's mother, who had passed away years earlier. Henry fully comprehended the gravity of his actions, and he moved rapidly to consolidate his newly acquired powers. Two principal issues demanded his attention. Firstly, Catherine of Aragon continued to enjoy widespread popularity, and the majority of the English populace sympathized with her situation and that of her and Henry's daughter Mary, who was now being legally excluded from the line of succession. Secondly, the vast majority of the English people remained devout Roman Catholics and regarded figures like Cranmer with suspicion, viewing them as clerics now intent on leveraging the king's marital predicament to impose a Protestant reformation upon England. Henry understood the necessity of establishing control swiftly. His solution was the Act of Supremacy, which he proposed following his marriage to Anne, and which Parliament passed in 1534. The act mandated that all the king's subjects take an oath acknowledging Henry as the supreme head of the church and affirming the legality of the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Refusal to swear the oath would be deemed treason, and all office holders and individuals in positions of political influence would be required to swear it. Many refused, most notably Henry's esteemed former friend and mentor, Sir Thomas More. More had largely withdrawn from court and public life in general in 1532, disheartened by the direction of political events, although he had readily capitalized on Wolsey's downfall to become Lord Chancellor a few years earlier. As of 1535, he remained one of the few prominent subjects of Henry who had not yet taken the oath. His refusal to comply soon resulted in More's imprisonment in the Tower. At his trial, when it became clear that a guilty verdict was inevitable, he vocally affirmed the authority of the Pope and rejected Henry's supremacy over the Church of England. For this defiance, he was sentenced to death for treason, a crime that carried the horrific penalty of being hung, drawn, and quartered. It serves as a minor testament to Henry's recollection of More's friendship and service to him that Henry commuted his sentence to beheading. The punishment was carried out on the 6th of July, 1535, immediately before which More declared in a clear and resonant voice that he died, quote, "The king's good servant and God's first." Henry had finally eliminated all those who appeared to be overtly opposed to the new established order. The death of Catherine of Aragon from natural causes on the 7th of January, 1536, seemed to remove the final obstacle to the legitimacy of Henry and Anne's marriage. Yet a somber shadow persisted. Anne had become pregnant on 2 subsequent occasions in rapid succession following Elizabeth's birth. In the spring of 1536, following another miscarriage, accusations of Anne's alleged infidelity became widespread at court. Henry chose to accept these allegations as true. Private questioning of the Queen's household staff elicited fantastical claims of her moral depravity, with several individuals accusing her of plotting against the king, committing adultery, and even engaging in incestuous relations with her own brother George. At a hastily assembled trial, at which Anne was not permitted to be present, she was found guilty and on the 31st of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to the execution site and beheaded. With poise and dignity, she spoke briefly and movingly of her love for the king, acknowledging her sins of pride and expressing her wish that the people would pray for her. The precise circumstances surrounding her trial have been extensively debated, and even half a millennium later, there is no consensus as to whether the charges against her were entirely or only partially fabricated with the intention of removing her from the scene as quickly as possible. What is known is that within 24 hours of his second wife's execution, Henry was already betrothed to one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Lady Jane Seymour. She soon became his third wife. While Lady Jane, like her family, had sworn the oath of supremacy, she was a devout Catholic. Consequently, many anticipated that with Anne Boleyn now gone, Henry would backtrack on some of his more radical religious policies. However, the reforms, if anything, accelerated, and Henry directed Thomas Cromwell to commence the dissolution of England's monasteries around this time. In 1536, abbeys, religious shrines, and monasteries throughout England and Wales were suddenly brought under state ownership. The dissolution of the approximately 800 monastic institutions was undertaken for two primary reasons. Firstly, the Protestant reformers who had managed to attain positions of influence in England during the early 1530s, under the pretext of assisting the king with his great matter, harbored opposition to monasticism in general. Protestants viewed the religious orders as worldly organizations that had contributed to the Pope's corruption of the divine word and argued that monasticism lacked grounding in religious doctrine. Secondly, the king became convinced that dissolving the monasteries represented a sound strategy because it would result in an absolutely immense financial windfall, as their precious books, gold chalices, and other valuable items were sold off along with their lands. With these funds, Henry speculated, he could settle his debts and initiate a new war with France, a pursuit he considered the rightful duty of any English monarch. The dissolution was not implemented without resistance. In the autumn of 1536, a large-scale uprising erupted in the northern parts of England. This event became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry only managed to quell it through a combination of initial attempts at appeasement, followed by brutal retaliatory actions. Marching under the purported authority of the king and bearing banners depicting the 5 wounds of Christ, the rebels demanded the reinstatement of the abbeys, the reintroduction of sacred Catholic ceremonies, and the dismissal of the king's devious ministers who had, in their view, misguided him in recent times. The rebel force numbered an astonishing 40,000 strong, representing the largest army seen on English soil during the Tudor period up to that point. To pacify the multitude, Henry initially offered them pardons if they dispersed and ceased their rebellion. However, when further disturbances occurred, Henry unleashed a harsh repression, and hundreds of the rebel leaders were apprehended and executed. Indeed, even members of his own family were not spared Henry's fury, as when the wife who succeeded Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, implored him on her knees to restore the abbeys, he erupted with, quote, "Get up, do not presume to meddle in my affairs. Remember, Anne." The systematic destruction and seizure of monastic property continued rapidly for 4 more years. The confiscated wealth briefly positioned Henry as one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe. While internationally, England was often regarded as an outcast state by many, a country that had embraced the reviled Protestant faith, whose emergence was sparking religious conflicts and inquisitions across Europe. Henry remained undeterred, however. Instead, the king resolved to utilize his newly acquired fortune to enhance the country's defenses, ordering the construction of hundreds of forts and gun emplacements along the English coastline. The materials for these defensive structures frequently originated from the monasteries and abbeys themselves, effectively transforming England into a veritable island fortress. This defensive strategy, combined with the expanding English navy, established the blueprint for English defensive and offensive planning for many years thereafter. Between 1536 and 1539, Henry was also persuaded by Cranmer and others to pursue additional avenues to reinforce the new religious life of England. For example, the 10 Articles of Faith were published in 1536. An English translation of the Bible appeared in 1537, as did the Institution of the Christian Man, commonly referred to as the Bishop's Book. By 1539, it had become apparent to Henry that the theological and doctrinal distinctions between Catholics and Protestants had solidified, and the religious situation had grown even more complicated. Henry recognized that preserving his supremacy and ensuring religious harmony would necessitate uniformity. If he could not simply proclaim it, he would be compelled to impose it through legislation. Thus, Henry first convened a special committee composed of clergymen to deliberate upon 6 doctrinal questions, the answers to which would form the fundamental articles of faith for the Church of England. Naturally, the committee understood what was expected of them, and they produced 6 articles of faith that essentially upheld the Catholic doctrines and practices with which Henry and many other conservatives in England felt comfortable. English Protestants were disheartened, and it seemed that the only aspect of Catholic doctrine that the 6 articles had omitted was allegiance to the Pope. This, in essence, represented the core objective of the Henrician Reformation, creating a Catholic Church where Henry, rather than the Pope, held the position of supreme leader. These shifts and turns in religious policy warrant some additional explanation. At this juncture in 1539 and 1540, there appeared to be a discernible leaning back towards Catholicism. The reason for this was that Henry himself was never a Protestant. As a doctrinal Catholic, he had permitted some Protestant reformers to gain positions of authority within the English Church in the early 1530s because they had facilitated his divorce. He then allowed them to continue introducing a moderate form of Lutheranism in the mid-1530s as they enriched him through their proposal to dissolve the country's religious houses. However, by the close of the decade, with the Protestant factions seemingly having nothing further to offer him, he reacted against the earlier reforms and essentially reimposed Catholic doctrine, while crucially maintaining the separation from Rome and his own supremacy over the Church of England. This final realignment in 1539 and 1540 would constitute the last major shift of the Henrician Reformation. Consequently, the Church remained doctrinally Catholic until the end of his reign, and a more comprehensive Protestant Reformation would have to await the subsequent reign. All of this transpired under the rule of a monarch who appeared increasingly tyrannical throughout the 1530s. Henry was widely admired as a generous and amiable ruler in his early years, but later in life, he was often perceived as a bully with a formidable temper. There exists a reasonably concrete explanation for this alteration in temperament. Henry was in nearly constant pain due to a persistent disability. On the 24th of January 1536, 2 days before Anne Boleyn suffered her final miscarriage and 5 months prior to her execution, the still robust 45-year-old Henry was involved in a severe accident during a jousting tournament when he was thrown from his horse. The heavily armored horse then fell upon Henry, nearly crushing his leg, and he remained unconscious for several hours. Upon regaining consciousness, he would discover that his life had been irrevocably changed. The accident had reopened a previous wound on his leg, which over time became progressively more ulcerated. Part of the problem stemmed from the belief among 16th century physicians that wounds should be left open to allow pus to drain continuously, the accumulation of which, according to the humoral theory of medicine prevalent at the time, could lead to illness. Many of the treatments Henry underwent over the remaining 10 years of his life likely caused more harm than good. Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour later that same year and her subsequent pregnancy 7 months thereafter likely rekindled Henry's hopes for the future. Henry and Jane had been married for approximately 15 months when she gave birth to Prince Edward. This event seemingly fulfilled all of Henry's long-held aspirations for a male heir. But tragically, Jane survived for only another 2 weeks, succumbing to puerperal fever after Edward's birth. Although overjoyed by the birth of a son, Henry was devastated by Jane's death. Whether it was because she had provided him with the male heir he had so desperately desired, or because their marriage had not endured long enough for Henry's affections to wane, the king entered a period of profound mourning and seclusion. He would not marry again for more than 2 years. However, both Henry and his courtiers understood that a single son was insufficient to guarantee the security of the throne. After all, Henry himself had ascended to kingship because his elder brother had died prematurely. Consequently, people soon began urging him to remarry and produce a spare heir. Henry's 4th wife was Anne of Cleves, a German princess and sister to the Duke of Cleves. Marriage negotiations were initiated as part of efforts to mitigate England's international isolation by brokering an alliance with the Schmalkaldic League, an association of small Lutheran principalities in Germany. Henry commissioned the renowned Tudor court painter Hans Holbein to travel to Germany and paint Anne's portrait. Upon receiving Holbein's depiction of her, Henry admired Anne's beauty and poise, but when she arrived in person in England, Henry expressed intense disappointment, reportedly shouting abuse at Thomas Cromwell and exclaiming, "I like her not." Nevertheless, having already estranged himself from predominantly Catholic Europe, Henry was unwilling to offend his new German allies and thus dutifully married Anne of Cleves on the 6th of January, 1540. However, as the Catholic backlash against the Protestant reforms persisted in the weeks that followed, Henry immediately began seeking avenues to have the marriage annulled. "She has evil smells about her," Henry insisted after the wedding night, seemingly disregarding his own odor emanating from his ulcerated leg. He also claimed that the, quote, "looseness of her breasts and other tokens indicated that she was not a virgin." Within 6 months, Henry secured an annulment of his marriage to Anne on the grounds of her supposedly binding prior agreement to marry the son of the Duke of Lorraine. Anne fared more favorably than most of Henry's wives. She accepted the annulment with grace, and Henry granted her an estate and an annual income. She would reside in England for the remainder of her life. Henry then ordered the imprisonment of his Lord Privy Seal, Thomas Cromwell, in the Tower, attributing to him the mishandling of the king's marriage arrangements. Cromwell was subsequently beheaded on the 28th of July, 1540. On the very same day, Henry married the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, the 17-year-old Catherine Howard. Like Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard has often been portrayed in an unflattering light. Her conduct, however, offers significant insight into her marriage to the king. Henry was 51 years old when he married Catherine and was progressively becoming older, sicker, and heavier. She initiated a clandestine affair with Thomas Culpeper, one of the royal grooms, arranging secret meetings, writing him love letters, and sending him gifts. Rumors of her actions soon began to circulate, and it eventually came to light that she had also engaged in a sexual relationship with her private secretary, Francis Derham, prior to marrying the king. Catherine would pay the ultimate cost for the errors of her tragically brief life. She was beheaded on the 13th of February, 1542, at the age of 19, the day after the executions of both Culpeper and Derham. The shifts and turns in political policy were not entirely confined to England. Henry, for example, more fully integrated Wales into the English state through legislation enacted in the 1530s and early 1540s. Even more significant were developments in Ireland. The English lordship had first been established there due to a partial conquest of the island in the 12th and 13th centuries. However, the civil wars of the 15th century had weakened English rule. Although Henry had considered leading an army to Ireland at various points during the 1510s and 1520s, he never did so, ultimately deeming any expenditure in Ireland to be wasteful. He was, however, compelled to act when the son of the Earl of Kildare rebelled in 1534. In the aftermath of this event, a group of officials in Dublin persuaded the government that a more interventionist program of gradual conquest of the independent Irish lordships was desirable to reassert English power in Ireland. Consequently, in 1541, Henry became the first English king of Ireland when an act for the kingly title was passed through the Irish Parliament. All his predecessors had held the subordinate title of Lord of Ireland. This change signaled a commitment to expanding English rule on the island, and a major campaign of conquest and colonization would be initiated from 1546 onwards, with profound consequences for the course of Irish history. Henry and Catherine seemed to enjoy a marriage characterized by both cooperation and companionship, and when Henry launched yet another invasion of France in 1544, he appointed Catherine as regent in his absence, a clear affirmation of his trust in her abilities. While they appeared to be a good match, they did encounter disagreements regarding religious matters. Catherine Parr was a devout Protestant reformer. She authored no fewer than 3 books, all of which bore witness to her religious convictions. Her second book, Prayers and Meditations, published in 1545, holds the distinction of being the first book published by an English queen under her own name. Her writings did not endear her to the more traditional religious elements at court, many of whose prejudices Henry himself shared. Catherine did not publish her third book, The Lamentation of a Sinner, until after Henry's death. The final major undertaking of Henry's reign was his renewed conflict with France. This was once again part of a larger conflict between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg dynasties and the French monarchy. It also became the most extensive of the 3 wars Henry fought against King Francis I of France. 2 key aspects characterized this conflict. Firstly, Henry essentially squandered the entire enormous financial windfall he had acquired from the dissolution of the monasteries by dispatching an army to France, a force that achieved nothing of significance other than capturing the town of Boulogne, located south of Calais. It would be governed as a new English territory there for a few years before being returned to the French. The second aspect of the war, which held greater significance in some respects, involved Henry's forceful attempts to compel the Scots into arranging the marriage of their infant queen, Mary the First, who had succeeded her father, James the Fifth, when she was just a week old in December 1542, to Prince Edward. Henry's objective in pursuing what became known as the rough wooing was to endeavor to unite Scotland under English authority by having the future children of Edward and Mary eventually rule over a unified Britain. The conflict with the Scots was still actively underway at the time of Henry's death, and the rough wooing would ultimately fail, mirroring the outcome of virtually every other element of Henry's foreign policy throughout his long reign. By late 1546, Henry had become increasingly unwell, and after making a few final revisions to his will, he withdrew from public life into seclusion at Whitehall Palace. His condition worsened steadily throughout the month of January 1547. Yet Henry's physicians were apprehensive about informing him of their strong suspicion that he was nearing death. On the evening of the 27th of January 1547, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to hear Henry's final confession. By the time Cranmer arrived, he found that the king's condition was such that he was incapable of speech. Cranmer offered comfort to the king by asking if he trusted in God. In response, the king squeezed Cranmer's hand. Henry died in the early hours of the morning of the 28th of January 1547, at the age of 55. It was in many ways a fitting conclusion to his life in the unusual religious changes that had occurred during his reign, with the Catholic monarch receiving the last rites from a Protestant archbishop. With the king's passing, his son, by Jane Seymour, became King Edward VI. As a 9-year-old, he was clearly incapable of governing in his own right for several years. During this interim, his government would be controlled first by his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, who served as regent until early 1550, and then by John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, thereafter. The young king was surrounded by Protestant reformers, and in the late 1540s, a much more comprehensive Protestant Reformation was initiated. This saw English churches stripped of their wealth and elaborate ornamentation, the Bible made widely accessible in English, and a new Book of Common Prayer issued as a guide for English men and women to engage directly with divine scripture. Archbishop Cranmer, whom Henry had elevated to such prominence in the 1530s, was the principal architect of many of these changes. Ultimately, this represented a short-lived attempt at a radical Calvinist Reformation, as Edward died in the summer of 1553 at the young age of just 15. A brief attempt by the Protestant faction in court to install Lady Jane Grey, a grandniece of Henry VIII, as Edward's successor in the 2 weeks following the death of Henry's son, proved unsuccessful. With this, Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, acceded to the throne. Those present when Queen Mary was crowned at Westminster on the 1st of October 1553 must have questioned the ultimate purpose of all Henry's actions. Here was his daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, being crowned Queen of England after all. Yet 5 years later, a certain sense emerged when Mary also passed away, and her half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, ascended as Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant, albeit a quite moderate one. She oversaw the establishment of an Anglican church that her father would likely have approved of. Henry's life and reign represented a compelling combination of both the finest and the most regrettable aspects of monarchical conduct in early modern Europe. His reign initially offered great promise and commenced favorably, marked by a happy marriage to Catherine of Aragon and efforts to reassert England's position as a significant European power on the continent after the decline brought about by the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. Guided by figures such as Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas More, Henry was a respected king and a staunch defender of the Roman Catholic Church. What is your opinion of King Henry VIII? Do you believe he was an unnecessarily autocratic monarch? Or were his actions understandable in light of the political crises that had gripped England for decades throughout the 15th century?